My name is Bridget Berg, and I am the new director of Silver Special Collections. So I've been here about 6 months now. I've been saying today I gave a credible 1-minute version of the founding of the history, or the history of the founding of the University of Vermont today. So I'm feeling like I'm, gaining some traction and learning things every single day. I am here really just to welcome you to our book talk today. Appreciate everyone being here. We are recording in order to accommodate the requests that we have for people who couldn't make it this afternoon. I do want to also thank the Center for Research on Vermont and the new director, Holly Painter, who is here today for co-sponsoring this event. So very, very, very pleased to see you all. Please all turn your cell phones off if you haven't. That's my logistical direction, and I'm going to hand it over to Prudari to do an introduction of our speaker.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Rudy Doherty, the Public Services Librarian in Special Collections, and I'm pleased to introduce Dona Brown. Dona, where are you? Dona retired from teaching history in 2023 after nearly 30 years at UVM, where she taught courses in everything from book history to American regionalism, with Vermont as a focal point for both her teaching and her research. My Special Collections colleagues and I joined Dona and her students in many adventures in the archives over the years. Dona has produced an impressive collection of articles, essays, and books. She's published articles on the history of tourism and regionalism in journals and collections, and is the editor of a collection of 19th century tourist stories. Her first 2 books are primarily cultural history. Inventing New England examines the evolution of New England's regional identity through a study of its 19th century tourist industry. And Back to the Land explores the ideas and practices of American back-to-the-landers over the course of the 20th century. Since her retirement, she's completed a 3rd book, Hill Farms: Surviving Modern Times in Early 20th Century Vermont. In Hill Farms, she focuses on the small mountain town of Jamaica in southern Vermont. Today, she will share what she learned about the town's hill farms from close analysis of field notes gathered during a 1930 study conducted by the Vermont Eugenics Society. Following Dona's presentation, there will be time for questions and discussion. It's yours.
lovely exhibit that folks put out for me about my books reminded me of something that I really don't forget very often, which is that last one, Hill Farms, is the same size as the others, but believe me, it's a lot more blood, sweat, and tears. It's a long, long project I've been working on, better part of a decade. So what I want to do today is just give you a kind of a flash look at some of the interesting things that emerge from these documents. I rewrote my title 12 times trying to say, Vermont Hill Farms in 1930, a little bit of information coming from the archives or something like that, but I just decided I would trust you. So let's start with a visualization. One afternoon in the autumn of 1930, a woman visits a farmhouse. The woman who is the lady of the house was expecting her. She makes her tea, they sit down and they talk for hours. They talk about her family, about her household chores, talk about her neighbors. Maybe her husband comes in and he says hello, and the visitor asks him about his farming and his crops that year. Maybe the kids come home from school and she talks with the kids about their plans for their lives. But this is not a social call. That's her.
Is anybody need Dona to use a microphone? Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Push it up or turn it on.
is not a social call, right? As you can guess from what we've been saying so far. This visitor had a job to do. She went home with notes like this, tracking where the household members were born, what their ancestry was, where they lived, their religion, their ethnicity, everything you would think that they might be interested in. She also recorded the farm's income, its acreage, how much it was worth, how much it produced, what things they grew. She assessed the cleanliness of the house and the dooryard, the home's conveniences or lack thereof. She wrote about the decor. She even described the residents of the house, how they looked, what their characters were like, all kinds of things like that. This visitor's not operating on her own. She is one of a team of 3 investigators. And that autumn, they were working in the little mountain town of Jamaica. The Brattleboro Daily Reformer explained to the readers that the team was there to investigate, quote, the effect of the moving of people from towns to cities. And the results of the study, they promised, would point the way toward an unspecified constructive program for the state. Basically true, if a little on the vague side. The team was in Jamaica to investigate the problem of what was usually called rural decline, a problem of many years standing in Vermont by then. The phrase could refer to many things, usually population decline, but also the loss of farms and the reforestation of fields. The problems have been around for decades, but they are receiving new kinds of attention in the 1920s. Towns like Jamaica, throughout rural New England and New York, were getting accustomed to visits from investigators like these, looking into the causes of rural decline. Many, many different kinds of investigations. This is just a random assortment. Expenditures for food and farm families, some conditions and needs among the rural schools. This is the soil survey from 1930 of the whole state. This is one of many beautiful handwritten, hand-colored maps coming from a major 13-town study about decline in the hills. The problem seemed so urgent that in 1928, the leaders of Vermont took what was, for them, the unprecedented step of establishing a statewide organization to coordinate and multiply the effects of experts studying rural problems. This was, of course, the Vermont Commission on Country Life, made up of 16 communities, almost all of which launched inquiries into some aspect of the problem of rural decline. Everything from soil quality to church attendance was being tested. Nearly every committee hired its own researchers. And our team in Jamaica was just part of that broader initiative. They worked for one of the commission's committees alongside the soil scientists and geographers and home economists and so forth, but their specialty was eugenics. So I think it's important to put them in the context of this larger research project, social science project that was going on at the time. Our team in Jamaica was part of the Vermont Commission on Country Life, which was technically an independent organization, although in reality founded and organized by the Eugenics survey, by Henry Perkins in particular. So, although he tried to keep a low profile in regard to his participation in the Commission on Country Life, the Commission on Country Life is really an extension in some ways of the Eugenics survey. And in particular, in this regard, it was. Our team worked both for the Eugenics survey itself and for the specific committee on the commission that had to do with eugenics, which was called the Committee on the Human Factor. So this project is called the Migration Study in-house, and it's set up to study not just the causes of people moving out of the state, and it's not there to study immigrants into the state. There were other people doing that. I think one of my former graduate students has written quite a bit on the subject of other studies that were done in under the auspices of the Commission on Immigration into Vermont. But this one is to investigate the impact of out-migration. Why are they in Jamaica? Given what we mostly know or associate with eugenics, it might seem odd at first. Jamaica was considered to be one of the most quintessentially Yankee towns in Vermont. This was, it wasn't really all that, but this particular committee even wrote in this report that it was, of all the studies they had done, the least racially mixed. The least infiltrated with foreign stock is the way they put it. But one major feature of the eugenics movement, which is somewhat less salient, somewhat less understood now, is their focus on the degeneration of the white race. For example, that infamous Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, had to do with the involuntary sterilization of a young white woman in Virginia. So it's not uncommon. For Vermont's eugenicists, it was actually the deterioration of the state's rural Yankee stock that was the most threatening to the future of the state. And they're not in Jamaica to count the declining numbers of people in town, but to assess the quality of the remaining population. Eugenicists believed, in common with a great many other Vermonters in the 1920s, that rural out-migration was characterized by what they always called the best and the brightest leaving the state, or leaving the countryside, leaving the rural areas, right? So if the best and the brightest are leaving, what is remaining there in these small towns and on these farms, is it a degenerated white population? That's their major question. The study of Jamaica then is an investigation into the quality of the social and genetic material of those who stayed behind. They didn't come right out and talk about this that openly. You can see that they didn't name this study something like degenerate Yankee families in rural Vermont or defect in the hill towns or something like that. In fact, they got a lot of pushback when they really emphasized rural white deterioration of stock. And they weren't always wanting to bring that up. So this is named the very bland selective migration from 3 rural Vermont towns and its significance. Selective, however, really means that the good people have left. But this is not just a eugenics thing. The investigators are part of a larger shift in thinking about farms in Vermont in the 1920s. Rural decline is closely associated with places Vermonters called hill farms. This is from one of the FSA photographs from the mid-1930s, one of several that are labeled specifically hill farms. As you can see, hill farms doesn't necessarily mean something geographical. It might, but it doesn't always. It's hard to find farms in Vermont that aren't on some kind of slope. But they're not all hill farms. That term has been used for a long time by then to refer to farms that were relatively small, relatively isolated, probably less prosperous than others, often but not always on relatively steep slopes. By the 20s, though, you can really hear the term hill farm coming to mean something else, something more negative. A little bit like the word hillbilly in southern Appalachian mountains, right? Similar kind of thing. It's associated more and more with someone who's not changing with the times, someone who was left behind, maybe someone who's refusing to keep up. And a label like that is needed in Vermont by then because so many other farms are changing, specifically coming to modernize in specific kinds of ways that are associated with modern dairy production. So here's a couple of FSA photographs from a more modern farming situation. These are fluid milk producers. You can see, this is about, I think that photograph was taken about 5 years after that study, the one that I've been working on. You can see this farmer has this absolutely spotless milk house, washable cement floors, stainless steel everything. And this is a different farm carrying its milk to market. So what's going on there is, it's not that Vermont farmers haven't farmed for market before this, they certainly have, but these kinds of changes are driving more profound and long-lasting changes to farm practices, and everything from the use of artificial fertilizers to borrowed money. Embedding farmers much more in marketplace transactions and in cash exchange, embedding them much more in what at the time was cutting-edge technology, expensive cutting-edge technology. And all of it's encouraged and instructed by a new generation of agricultural specialists. I'll bet you can guess which one of those guys is the extension agent, dressed super urban. And so that's, I think, a classic case of where the extension agent is coming to assist this guy in his modernization project. All of this at the time that hill farms, in contrast, are defined by their being far away from markets. Their operators unable or perhaps unwilling to modernize, persist in their small-scale, diversified, old-fashioned farming practices. And here's a lovely example of why that might be the case. This is a major road in downtown-ish kind of Jamaica. And a nice-looking farm back there. And how are they going to get the milk truck down there in summer, let alone fall, winter, and spring? So the hill farms have been losing population for decades. But in the old days, and this is the major change, I think more important than anything else, what's happening in the 20s that's different, is that in the old days, the agricultural leaders of Vermont had believed that it was their duty to support hill farms and their inhabitants, and to defend the hill towns from the demographic forces that were threatening to destroy them. And the Vermont Commission on Country Life explicitly stated in its opening days that that was its goal too, that it was there to preserve farms, to keep people on farms, and to make sure that life on the farms was so good that people didn't need to leave, okay? But by the time the commission was organized, increasing numbers of Vermont's leaders saw the hill farms more as a liability than as a historical legacy, and the hill farms really more as perpetrators than as victims of rural decline. And by that time, things had finally changed to a point where policymakers were beginning to consider the idea, strange as it may now seem, of solving the problems of rural decline by removing the farmers from the hill farms. The Eugenics team's final report on Jamaica, in fact, would play a key role in supporting that agenda, recommending that the state, quote unquote, encourage the removal of people from Jamaica farms, and in fact all farms on hills, all these poor, isolated, distant farms, and resettling those people in areas that would allow them to gradually repair their social and genetic decline in a different environment. Those conclusions are based in part on the evidence that they gathered, but in some ways the Eugenics team had already been, their outcome had already been determined before they got there. The investigators in Jamaica were told at the outset by the Commission's advisory committee that Jamaica was in, quote, poor condition. Waitsfield, they did 3 studies. Waitsfield was supposed to be the one in good condition. Cornwall was the one in fair condition, and Jamaica was chosen to represent poor condition. They already believed that the best and the brightest had left town. Naturally, they expected to discover that the community and its people were in some ways deeply harmed by the loss of the best and brightest. So that's what they found. My own scholarly interests, I suppose I need to say here, are somewhat different from that of the investigators. And I have used their data, their notes, their knowledge gathered during that fall of 1930 to answer, or to at least to address, very different questions. I think about it this way now, most of my life's work has been focused on New England history, on rural New England, and as far as I know, it has always been declining. the image, it's true, the image of the abandoned farm has been stamped onto the history of the region since the Civil War and even before, and especially in the northern hills. We know this. The story of decline seems written into the landscape itself. Stone walls go through the woods, barns collapse, towns dwindle. This is our story. That's us. And there's no doubt that a lot of that really did happen. But from the very beginning, I think, historians have cloaked that story in an aura of inevitability, as if predetermined by irresistible environmental forces, stony hills, cold winters, or by forces that we have come to think of as almost equally irresistible, by industrialization and modernization. And that those inevitable forces foreclosed the opportunity for the hill farms and made the story of their loss not something for discussion, just a fact. I've never really trusted that narrative. I couldn't put my finger on it. Stony hills and cold winters we have always had with us. Yet farmers chose to come to the hills, to farm in the hills, and at least some of them to stay in the hills. It seemed unlikely to me, and I guess this is the critical thing, it seemed unlikely to me that the hill farmers in all those declining towns would have told their story in quite this way. History has left us many, many accounts of the views and the opinions of the members of the Vermont Commission on Country Life and all of their investigators. But the voices of rural working people are very rarely heard in historical sources, even as late as 100 years ago. What I saw in these field notes was an opportunity to ask those questions about decline to the people who are actually living in one of these declining places and times. Of course, like other materials created by unsympathetic observers, Nazis and the Inquisition and so forth, they all left really good records, and so did these guys. You have to obviously be careful how you read them, but the three investigators here were remarkably diligent recorders of what they found, and they carefully documented many things they did not fully understand. They often recorded verbatim comments from residents, and they were candid about their own feelings. They often wrote in those documents about how they felt about what they were looking at. So, what did the documents reveal? I won't try to summarize everything I learned from my many years of study of Jamaica. You'll have to at least flip through the book. I'll try instead just to give you a quick glimpse at a few of the kinds of materials that I think illustrate how rich these sources are and help us to understand more about the voices that come through these documents. So I'm going to start with just a few examples of things that can be taken from these notes that are quantifiable. Of course, ethnic and religious backgrounds, length of time in town, those are the classic eugenics questions. They want to know who's left, who's still there. They want to know about their religious and ethnic background and so forth. But the other parts, the size of the farms, the size of the herds, the annual household income, the acreage cultivated, how they used it, those are things that are quantifiable and are very suggestive. They open up all kinds of lines of questioning that can be then turned to the more qualitative parts of the documents. So here's an example. Also, I just wanted to show you that this is really hard reading these documents. That's the first section. And you can see that it has this very specific, this guy happens to be an Adventist, and you can see his crops, potatoes in the garden, you can see how many acres, you can see farm and life, got it written down here, 600 gallons of syrup, etc. Okay, so I want you to look at a couple of things there. Here's a farmer who reports that he owns 4 milking cows and 4 yoke cattle. And then he also has 140 hens that he sells maple syrup and potatoes, and that he takes in boarders. In this case, it's summer vacationers. His farm is on a very beautiful road, with a gorgeous view, and he had people come and sort of tent on his property in the summer. So first point, almost everybody in town milked cows. 4 out of 5 families in Jamaica produce some dairy products. But these dairy herds are quite small, not the kind of dairy herds that were becoming the norm in Vermont. In comparison with the rest of Vermont, which had an average of 19 cows per cow herd, this average is 6. Rather than dairy farms, these are more like what the census categorized as general farms in 1930, meaning more old-fashioned farms where the farmer relied more on a mix of cash crops and not on a single one, or maybe in part on his own consuming what he was growing, as we used to say. But these are not the norm in Vermont anymore. If you look at this data, I'll just indicate what's the most obvious thing here. These are sizes of herds in Waitsfield, in Cornwall, and Jamaica. And you can see up there at the top that 22% of Jamaica farmers own 1 cow, and 59% own somewhere between 2 and 9. Whereas in Cornwall and in Waitsfield, the numbers are really reversed. In Cornwall and Waitsfield, the large majority of people own much larger herds. And that is quite the norm in Vermont in these years. So it's not just that they are staying back at the old days, but they are keeping small herds. They're keeping small herds at a time when other people are growing theirs. Most of Vermont's agricultural experts believed that dairy was the one best shot Vermont farmers had to compete on a national market. And that successful dairy farming demanded a total departure from older patterns like this, toward much greater specialization, toward bigger farms, toward bigger cows, toward more machinery, and certainly toward larger herds of dairy cattle. So these figures in the first part of the forms that I showed you suggest that Jamaica farmers are not buying into what the agricultural extension agents are telling people. And it isn't just that the herds are smaller either. In Jamaica, roughly half of the farms selling dairy products were still producing butter or cream. Those are old-fashioned products by 1930 for declining markets, rather than converting to the newer fluid milk. So fluid milk is just what they call milk, with its new demands for speed and cleanliness, because fluid milk is going to markets that need it to be there very quickly, that need it to be tested for a lot. It's not going to go through any kind of process of sitting around like cream and butter did, which you probably don't want to know about. It isn't just that it's hard for these farmers to get into the fluid milk market because of their being far away from folks. But if you look more deeply into the notes, you can see a different set of reasons. A pair of brothers, for example, explained to one interviewer that they sold little or no milk because they used almost all of it to feed their calves. And another farmer said the same thing. He had decided to begin shipping milk rather than cream, but he said to the interviewer he hated to do it because for then he won't have any for his calves. And that's similar to what's going on in this document. You cannot see here, but you have to trust me that it says up there, cows, $200 for sale of 2. Okay, so these guys are doing the same thing. What this means is that rather than specializing in milk, they are diversifying. They're selling some cattle as calves for beef. They're selling some perhaps as replacement stock at first to other farmers. Who knows what else they might be doing with them. And I won't go into this in great detail, but in Jamaica, this was a very old pattern. They always milked, but they always paid more attention to the stock as their chief investment. That's also not the norm. And here's another thing that's not the norm. the eugenicists asked farmers what income they made from what crops, both net and gross. This is this same farmer, gross $1,500, net dot. They don't know what their net is. That's proportionally also much bigger in Jamaica than it is in the other towns that I looked at. Jamaica farmers, by and large, are not able to tell, or anyway, they don't tell the investigators what their net income is. Part of the reason for that is right there. This is his year. Chief income from poultry and trapping. And yet he forgot to write down what he got from poultry. Last year they cleared the following amounts. This is their income. Okay, so you tell me how to figure out net on that. Go ahead, I'll wait. It's not gonna happen. What is the net on trapping? Most farmers are not yet counting their hourly commitments. They're only counting things that they actually have to buy off farm as an expense. And this guy is not buying many things off farm. He might be buying some feed for his cattle, but he doesn't count that. So in other words, they're not giving net figures because net figures don't matter to them. They aren't well educated enough to figure out the mathematical stuff that would be involved for the most part, but they don't. And here you can see also that that is an unusual outlying kind of a situation. In Jamaica, farms using only gross figures is over twice what those are using net figures. And whereas in Waitsfield, the commercial center of Waitsfield, it's 10 to 1 that they know how to figure out net. Waitsfield was a happening town in those days, I'm telling you. Okay, so in this regard too, Jamaica is increasingly out of step with other parts of Vermont. And there's yet one more closely related feature of farming in Jamaica that puts them in a different category from the two more commercially forward-looking towns. The interviewers referred to it as home use, or raising only enough for home use. I didn't translate this for you because I think you can see it. Just cultivated enough for home use, right on that first line there. Okay, so that means, theoretically, home use should be people who are just consuming what they're growing, right? Subsistence farmers. But in practice, in this setting, the eugenicists use the term to mean people who sold some stuff and used some stuff, right? So for example, one farmer, they wrote on his file, home use only, and then right underneath it, $300 this year from the cows and $200 from the maple syrup. So they clearly didn't mean he didn't sell anything, but they meant that he lived on his farm, that he produced what he needed for his farm, and that he sold what he had to sell, right? In other words, if you put that in the context of the previous 100 years of farming in Vermont, what you're saying is that these people are farming just like everybody in Vermont farmed 50 years before that. There's nothing unusual about this. Only the eugenicists didn't know that. But it is unusual at this point. Won't go into this, but the same figures are roughly there for compared to the other two towns. So, we could say that Jamaica farmers are operating old-fashioned farms, or farming as their grandparents had done. And that would be partly true. But Jamaica farmers were living not in the past, right? They were living in 1930, not in 1880. And they are having to deal with situations and with challenges that were not the same 50 years earlier. So here's another guy, this is another farmer. This farmer appears to be farming more or less exactly as his father had done in a previous generation, if you look at it first. In the 1880 agricultural census, this farm, the same farm that he's living on in 1930, belonged to his father, and this father reported to the census takers that he was selling butter, that he was selling maple sugar, and they had a workshop where he repaired wagons for his neighbors. He was a wheelwright. Okay? This guy reported to the Eugenics that he's selling milk, and that he's selling maple syrup, and that he's using that workshop to repair furniture for his neighbors. All right, so he's substituted milk for butter, syrup for sugar, because the markets have changed. But his day and his farm must have been much like what the farm was like when he grew up on it. Except for one thing. Looking closely at the field notes, you can get a sense of the profound changes that this farm is going through, and this farmer himself. This slide shows that in 1895, the family bought a second farm. So it says up there, year of farm purchased, 1855. And then it says plus 1890, I can't tell, 1893. So they bought a second farm. In his father's will, this second farm is referred to as a hill farm. It's higher up than their home farm. And what that second farm suggests to me is that they have begun to investigate into, how shall I say this? They've begun to invest in spreading out their operation more broadly, but using it less intensively. It looks as if the family has allowed that second farm to continue to revert to woods. As the investigator writes, they no longer cut, meaning they're not cutting hay out there anymore. It just was pasture land. They're now maybe grazing, or maybe not. They're not cutting hay on it anymore. Their cattle do graze up there. He's still raising dairy cattle like his grandfather had done, but his herd is grazing now on those old, probably brushy upland pastures of the second farm, or maybe even among the maple trees, which is his maple, they call it his maple grove. I think we would say sugar bush, was up there on that second farm. It was pretty common practice in the hills for farmers to graze their cattle in among the maple trees, keep the passages open in the maple trees so it's easy to sugar. It's not what you would do if you were attempting to maximize the efficiency and profitability and modernity of your dairy operation. A good, fancy, expensive Holstein is going to need better forage than that. They're not going to be able to sustain their high milk production and so forth. So it's the kind of thing you would do if you were minimizing labor and maximizing the use of your land without any more labor than you had available to you. And that probably was what he was doing. It's common in the hills. And it seems that the dairy herd was less central to their operation now. He told the investigator that his most important moneymaker, not like his father, his most important moneymaker now was his maple syrup. So he's shifting. He's reflecting a change that's happening all over the hills, all right, toward less intensive land use practices and more reliance on the products of the regrowing woods. Average farm sizes are growing as they use the land less intensively. So like his neighbors who still farmed, this farmer is shifting his cash needs more toward forest products like maple and lumber as the forest returned. This is a nice postcard from one angle looking over the side of one of the hills in Jamaica. You can see up there that hillside pasture, probably very much like the one that he was talking about, is showing real clear signs of reforestation. So, in sum, the documents tell us that many Jamaica farmers still follow old ways of farming. Low capital investment, diversified cash crops, subsistence-oriented farms. But we can also see that they were able to hold on to these old ways of doing business only by constantly adapting to the changing situation around them. As the population thinned, farmers' sons left home, are no longer available to work on their own or on each other's farms. Farmers make decisions to let returning brush come back to their outlying pastures. They concentrated more on forest products and working part-time off-farm in the woods and the mills. These are not mistakes, as a lot of experts saw them at the time. These were not the decisions of people who just didn't know how to farm. These were carefully considered methods of holding on to farming at a time when not that many options remained. So the experts knew most of this. Here's one last example from the field notes that I think might tell us a little about what they didn't know or didn't fully grasp. This one is a little more speculative than the cumulative data, so you don't have to trust me on it if you don't like the way I'm going to interpret it. So on October 24th, Ellen Anderson, who was the lead investigator of this group, visited a young couple and their 2 children. She thought their house looked bleak on the hillside. It was, she noted, the last house on the road, and she said that it was backing up to brush and reforested land. She records in the notes that the husband worked in a sawmill, which was a very common side gig for Jamaica farmers. He worked in that sawmill. You can tell that I didn't start off as a 20th century historian, because I'm still so thrilled with the idea that there's actual representations of visuals from this time period. Yeah, there it is, that's his mill. She records that he worked there when this mill was open, which had not been very often in this past summer. And that their farm had 80 acres, but that year he had cultivated only a half acre, mostly for potatoes. It was mostly using his farm for home use, for feeding the family, and then working for cash. Ellen Anderson reported her conversation with this lady this way. So here I've recorded it for you, translated it for you. A large, rather pleasant, though petulant-looking young woman, she never even moved from her chair by the window when opening the door to let the visitor in. Sat and rocked comfortably and answered the questions laconically. Even any switching around to other topics failed to make her more conversant. It was yes, no, I don't know. Here's a good example of where Ellen Anderson is allowing her frustration to become clear in the written notes, I think. She's like, I tried all these things, she didn't respond to any of them. And perhaps hoping to evoke some kind of, or provoke some kind of response from her, Anderson asked the woman if she didn't dread winter coming. And she wrote this down. She replied, no, don't bother me any. I like it all right. As long as I've got enough food and enough to keep me warm, I'm all right. And she kept on rocking gently. Now she's really annoyed. And to put this in context, I don't remember to have seen very many recalcitrant or hostile interviews. There were maybe 2 or 3 where somebody shut the door on them and wouldn't let them in. But there wasn't any other thing like this. And I wasn't sure that this woman was being hostile. When I first read this passage, I knew it was important, but I didn't know what to make of it. After a long time, and I mean years, working with the documents and thinking more about Jamaica and about the interviews and the whole historical situation, I came back to this handwritten account, and this time I noticed 2 things. First, why didn't Anderson ask her why she wasn't dreading the winter? This woman is pregnant, she has an 8-year-old child, her husband is completely out of work, and it's late October. Why is she not afraid of the winter? There are all kinds of possible reasons. Maybe she wasn't being quite honest. Maybe she was unwilling to discuss her situation with this probably well-dressed urban type who has come into her kitchen. But the second thing I noticed was that this lady did, in fact, explain to the eugenicist, although in a kind of oblique way that Anderson didn't quite recognize. In the section of the questionnaire describing the operations of the farm, Anderson jotted down what I finally began to see as this lady's answer to that unasked question. And that's this. And the thing that made me begin to interpret it this way is the quotation marks, which are Ellen Anderson's. Why do these phrases need quotation marks? Only a few chickens. She wrote only a few chickens on probably 30 other forms without putting it in quotation marks. So I finally began to think, what, she puts things in quotation marks when she doesn't believe them? When she doesn't like them? When she disagrees or she thinks that the person is wrong-headed? She puts things in quotation marks. All right, so what is to argue with here? We only have enough potatoes for ourselves. Why are these passages worthy of that careful treatment? All the quotation marks were about her interpretation of what Mrs. C was saying about their farm lives. Mrs. Anderson seems to have considered Mrs. C's statements as a kind of apology. Only a few chickens, just enough potatoes and milk. But I think a closer look at this whole passage and even this woman's body language as described by Anderson herself suggests that this woman was not in an apologetic mood. And I found this and I had to put it in. This is obviously not Mrs. C. This is an FSA photograph of a kid sitting in a rocking chair looking, I thought, really skeptical. So I had that as a kind of a gesture. I think she was not apologizing. I think she may even have been boasting a little bit. If her husband didn't make any money this winter, there were going to be tough times in this house, for sure. But there would be food on the table, and there would be a fire to keep them warm. Anderson is caught up in another narrative and was unable to hear that note, I think, in this passage. And that's typical of the kind of things eugenicists did not see. They weren't looking for information about how families like these got by in hard times. There was no space on the form to write down anything about the wood they split and that was stacked in the shed in late October, or about and here I'm taking a list from a study done by UVM home economists, anything about the potatoes, butter, milk, lard, eggs, cider, salt pork, bacon, venison, chicken, squash, cabbage, and apples that were probably appearing on these tables and were certainly in the root cellar. As it turns out, according to these home economics studies, in Mrs. C's cellar were probably all of these supplies as they were in the homes of people who were much richer than she was and people who were poorer than she was. It's just common practice. Understanding that, I think, makes it easier to catch that tone of confidence in that Yankee understatement. Maybe that laconic, long as I've got enough food and enough to keep me warm, I'm all right, meant more than Anderson thought it did. Or maybe Anderson heard it, that's why she put all the things in quotation marks. Perhaps Mrs. C was not just proud of her warm kitchen and her full cellar. Maybe she was proud of her family's self-reliance. Ellen Anderson did not ask her about any of that. And I think that's because the experts, not just the eugenicists, but almost all the experts who study the hills, were already convinced that these farms were destined to fade away into the woods, and that they ought to be replaced by state forests and by second homes for vacationers. The data they collected confirmed that judgment as far as they were concerned. But the Jamaica manuscripts, I think, cast the life of the hill farms in a different light. Above all, they highlight what I think Mrs. C meant. They pointed to the remarkable resilience and skill of her family and her neighbors, their capacity to make do with little, to work with the limits of their land, to adapt to a rapidly changing physical and social environment. The Jamaica records, read carefully, I think, suggest that there was much that was lost when these hill farms disappeared. Much, in fact, that we may need to recover one day on our own hard times.
Okay, Donna, you have it first.
Where did you find all of these documents?
The photographs are all completely free on the Federal American Memory site that was, all the photographs were taken in various places in the 1930s by the Farm Security Administration. Aren't they amazing? Yeah. The one on the front, the green one, is colorized, but that's another really beautiful one from the FSA.
Did you go to special collections?
Why? I was in special collections for years. These documents, these eugenics documents are at Middlesex, at the State Archives, so they're not here. But we have tons of, what I really used a lot here was massive amounts of printed materials. I read tons and tons of, home economics studies, and the land utilization study that I showed you with the colored pictures of the towns. That was done here as a master's program, a master's degree. So we have the handwritten, colorized master's thesis here. It's really amazing. So yeah, I've been there once or twice.
Yeah, Dona, how cooperative were the farmers in giving up this kind of information?
You wouldn't think they would.
And someone who called themselves a eugenicist.
Yeah, they were really cooperative. It's kind of alarming. I don't think they had any negative expectations of these studies. I don't think they thought the eugenicists were in any way different from the geographers or the home economists who came through and asked them. The home economic people asked these farm women to fill out a form like these every day for a year and write down every single thing they used in the kitchen and how much it weighed. And you still did it. So, I think they were just being very cooperative. Maybe there's some way, I know how many households were in Jamaica and how many answers they had.
Are we distinctive in Vermont for having this kind of resource, this kind of evidence?
I don't know. The field notes themselves are really new. There's a million studies of all kinds, and we have a printed version, the outcome, their summaries of what they found. It's very unusual to see the actual raw field note material. In the eugenics archives here in Vermont, there's a couple of other committees that also have some saved materials. One is the committee on the, I never remember the name of this, committee on the force of religion, or the committee on religious power, or something like that. I don't remember. It was a bunch of clergymen writing letters to all the clergymen in rural areas and saying, how bad is it with you? Or are people coming to church? And they would write back and say, no one comes to church. That kind of thing. So we have some archival material like that. And the woman, the person who did the study on the tourist boarding houses, those data, those raw notes are there. But I think most of them are not. So it's just luck.
Yeah, it seems like the huge variable here regarding some of the hill farms and the valley farms and soil type. And basically talking about, this is characterization of subsistence farming at a time when the fertility of the soil was just progressively getting washed away and it was nothing new.
So really interestingly, Tom, it says a really interesting question, and I spent many more hours than I care to think reading geology, looking at maps, and incredibly elaborate, beautiful maps of soil, and this study of soil like this was really only a generation old at that point. However, I will say that, and of course there's a million reasons why this might be true, but I will say that when the eugenicists were able to speak to the men of the houses they were interviewing, which wasn't that often, they mostly talked to the housewives. When they did, they asked them what is about their quality of their soil. And I only have 34 answers. Every single one was very good. Every single one. These are people farming if you've ever been to Jamaica. It's not going to be an easy road. Now, they also would say it's stony. Or they would say, some parts are stony, or my father got rid of the stones, or something like that. But I guess what I take from that is they weren't expected to be farming in Shaw. This wasn't, Shelburne. This wasn't the land of Shangri-La. This was just a farm for people to make a living on, And so I think it's right. I think that what happened in Vermont is that as that information about soil quality comes through to them, they took that to mean these people have got to go. Right? And they had reasons to think that. I won't deny it. But I'll just say that and leave it at that. Yeah.
So I may have my history wrong, but there's lots of potatoes,
Yeah.
and what comes out of potatoes is vodka sometimes.
Huh.
Is anybody making that, and is it illicit? Did that come through at all?
There's a little bit of gossip. That's about how it comes through. Is like, well, the neighbors say they're very happy to write down rotten gossip that somebody says about the town. So it'll be like the neighbors say that he drinks too much or that kind of thing. In theory, these towns were dry. In practice, no. I don't think so. They didn't drink in public or right in the middle of collective social events, that kind of thing, but they certainly drank.
Wasn't that the time that Prohibition was still in effect?
Yeah, sure.
Right, supposedly.
It was like double prohibition because up until prohibition, Vermont also already had prohibition. There were some changes going on, 1915 to like 1930. There were some parts of Vermont where you could drink legally. But the culture of small towns like this, part of being Yankee like that, is very much against open drinking. Mostly. I will give you, the obvious examples are places where men's culture really predominates, like in Dearmont. There you've got to expect people are drinking. Or anything like that, I think, hey, people are drinking. But I don't have any actual evidence on that. So I'm going to say they never. Paul.
It's really interesting, Donna. I'm struck by the documents themselves, right? And I was thinking about two things that came to me. In one instance, they identify the religion as Adventist, and the other is just Protestant.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about, like, if you have a sense of what was going into that.
Yeah.
And the other was the kind of ways in which they assess character. So ideas of respectability there are there for sure, but I'm
They
just
have a
wondering.
place that's called social condition. So, and they struggle like crazy with it. I'll answer about the Adventists in a minute. They struggled a lot to try to label. They labeled every family poor, or good, or whatever, social status. In theory, they meant, were they joiners? Were they part of the PTA? Did they belong to a church? In theory, that's what they were describing. Sometimes they were describing that. Sometimes they were describing what they thought their social class was. But that was also really difficult for them because a lot of times they would end up fighting in their own notes about it. They would say, social status, good, old family in town. And then they couldn't resist writing poor. Right? So, they were really bollocksed up about it, and their testimony to it is really kind of crazy. The main thing that comes out of it is how incredibly powerful family lineage is in a town like this and how much it goes for people's status. As far as Adventists goes, there was a really large collection, a colony of Seventh-day Adventists in Vermont, and a really large one in Jamaica. It was in the 1840s. They were the ones who went up on the top of the hills in sheets, waiting for the second coming. Millerites. They were Millerites, and that evolved into Seventh-day Adventists. So it was a quirky, weird religion that the Eugenicists didn't approve of. It wasn't as bad as Catholic.
They differentiated them from regular Protestants.
From not a normal Protestant.
Right.
Yeah.
They don't differentiate Methodists.
They know. In fact, most of the time when they ask, or not most of the time, but some of the times when they ask people what religion, one of them they wrote down, husband says he doesn't remember. It was some church. Haven't been there in a while. David, you go.
I love reading your book. Yeah, I just devoured it. And there's an interesting dynamic going on here with your eugenicists, right? Your progressives who think they have the right advice to offer and think they have the right social plan in mind and they want people to do what they're told, are watching the farmers and you are watching the eugenicists. And the impression that your book conveys is it's a marvelously, probably right on target, but a marvelously cynical one. Right? I mean, this is you and I have talked about this, right? Progressives too can go off the rails. And these are progressives who are just miserably judgmental. And that is, and come to foregone conclusions. Page 81, you've got a subtitle, which was one of my favorite lines in the book, which was something like, the conclusions on which the data were based. It's perfect. And I guess the question is, was that this very cynical, these people are judgmental, did you come to the documents this way, or was that part of what you sort of came to as you read them? What was your own journey like?
Oh, that's so interesting because I took it all out, but I spent a lot of time talking about who these people are, these three women are. They're really, in many ways, quite admirable human beings.
Yeah.
You know, the youngest one, Anna Rowe, was the secretary in the Eugenics office. She was 5 months. Her family was 5 months in this country from Lithuania when she was born in Little Jerusalem. She worked her way through high school. She got a high school degree. She got herself a white-collar job, and she's so smart that Perkins sticks her in the actual investigator. So I mean, they're really, and Ellen Anderson, you know, she has in many other ways a great reputation.
Born in Manitoba.
Yeah, born in Manitoba, Icelandic for crying out loud. So I think I was more surprised with how much I sympathized with them than how crazy they were. I think it's really easy to know what everybody else should do. I think it's almost a fail sign, you know. It's not something you even would blame for until it gets to this point where real lives are endangered by it. I mean, but I think one of the things I was working about with my journey of dealing with this is that speaking with my partner kept on saying to me, you have to explain, these are eugenicists. People are not going to trust what they've written. People are not going to, they're going to think you sympathize with eugenicists. They, you know, to be careful you don't come off like somebody who sympathizes with eugenicists. Like, well, you're saying I didn't, so that's good. They are really interesting people. And I don't think they're any different in their attitudes toward working people than everybody else in their social class. I know it's absolutely. They thought they were lazy, they thought they were foolish, they thought they didn't know their own best interests. I won't go on. That's another story.
In one of the slides, you have the income and Mrs. A at the bottom. Was nursing
Yes.
for income?
Yes. And that's also to do with their being Adventists. The Adventist community in Jamaica is really, really close-knit, small community, but they have a lot of connections with an Adventist hospital in Boston, a major, I think it's still a big hospital, major Adventist hospital in Boston, and they travel back and forth a lot, and a lot of training nurses coming out of that hospital where there are Adventist communities.
So she
She's probably, yeah, I don't remember.
She would collect the milk and send it to the hospital?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. The Adventist, there are still an Adventist community here. It's really interesting. Nancy?
Does the Jamaica Historical Society have any, did you look at any of their stuff?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if some of those say the descendants of families who's still there.
So, yeah. Oh, God, yes. In my book, I didn't use anybody's names. That was the policy of the archives at that time, and Richard says that they've given up on it. But I didn't use names, I used pseudonyms.
Yeah.
Partly I'm not sorry I did that, because you were down there giving a talk once years ago, right?
Well, back then, yeah, we were.
Yeah. They're, all the farm family names are still there.
Right.
I mean, and Richard and I had a debate about this. There's nothing shameful in having been targeted by the eugenicists, right? There's nothing they did wrong. But the eugenicists wrote a lot of dirt on people too. And so it would be like, well, you know, keep thinking about the guy whose parents, his neighbor said he kept his wife's sister hidden in the back room and, you know, married her after the second wife died. And, you know, not to see. I wouldn't want that in a book about my family name. Although my name is Brown, so who cares?
I gave a talk a number of years ago to a school down outside of Jamaica.
Yeah.
It was a private school, and they were K through 8, and the 8th graders, I had to read the whole Jamaica report. And Aylin Anderson said at the end, she said, oh, they call it Pennsylvania, they're just content to get by.
Yes.
That's her value system, not theirs. And it's such a beautiful village with these streets coming together. It would be nice to make it into a nice recreational. And they said, the kids said, that's exactly what happened. This Mount Snow,
It's exactly
and the school they went to had all these rich kids. And they said that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Miles, I think I left you behind.
I actually, my question was going to be, what was the composition background of the survey takers, which you haven't answered
Great.
there. I guess I had a sort of secondary question that is, I was really interested by, you mentioned the shifting the shifting perspective of thinking of hill farms as victims of rural decline to actually being perpetrators of rural decline. And that sort of popped this question in my head of, and you know, many farmers, both then and now, need to supplement their income with multiple streams of revenue, right? Like I don't mean to, but I guess I'm kind of thinking about legislators who kind of play farm, right? Who have already kind of made their money and now, and I'm wondering, were policymakers in Vermont at that time, would they be the farmers that had herds of cattle that were more than, you know?
In some places, yeah, like in the agricultural establishment, which was big and substantial and powerful, there would have been the guy who was the agricultural commissioner lived in Waitsfield, a successful town, right? He had I don't know, 45 or 50 cattle and, 300 acres and 20 guys working for him and, all kinds of stuff like that. So yeah, they would have been, and he had a lot to say about this kind of thing. At the level of like the Republican infrastructure, like the governors and stuff, it was more like play farming. And it was more like posturing than play farming even. Like there's a famous picture of one of those guys standing in his three-piece gray suit and holding a little pig.
As much of this is like, there's a lot of the description of this and looking at this, right, is the idea of like urban versus rural.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering how much of it is actually like affluent rural versus poor rural, you know?
Yeah, so there's not much affluent rural
Okay.
in 1929, 1930. I mean, there are examples of it, but there's not a lot. There are a few of these really amazing one-off estates, like in Shelburne, right? And along the lake. But not generally speaking. There are some prosperous farmers in places like Middlebury, in the valleys, some prosperous farmers, but not the kind of person you're talking about. Not like big estates filled with, with people putting all their income from the stock market into their cattle herd, that kind of thing. Not much around this time. It was pretty poor.
Stock market.
And the stock market, yes. It's funny to see because in autumn and summer and autumn of 1930, people who they were interviewing were still saying, they were still calling the Depression city problems. The problems of the city are really bad here, Like, yeah, you're about to find out.
There's so many commonalities between eugenics and environmental determinism, and they also aligned in time. And so I was thinking about the soil maps.
Yeah.
And wondered if you saw any kind of, weaving together of the that sort of environmental determinist viewpoint of like, well, people in these latitudes are just stupid, that kind of view. And
that kind of environmental determinism.
Yes, right. That was very common in, well, you mentioned geographers, so that was geography.
Geographers are going to come off the good by the way. But yeah, I mean, that's interesting because I think that the culture of Vermont was such that, I kind of mentioned this, that there was not a lot of power behind the notion of the country bumpkin or the sort of loser rural type. It wasn't that commonly done. People would make little jokes about old school Hill Farm type people. You know, they would say, oh, you know, they're married to the Republican Party or something. You know, they're like make jokes about their old fashions, but there wasn't like all this dumping of hatred on rural poor people the way there was in other parts of the state. This is probably the worst it gets. And it's mainly like they're deluded, they need help, kinds of stuff. It's not like they're, well, of course they did think that they were racially self-destructing, but that they got that about everybody. I mean, the thing that Ellen Anderson figured out about what was wrong with the people in Jamaica was tricky, because she didn't want to come right out and say, these people are genetically deficient. She didn't actually think they were genetically deficient. She thought that the atmosphere in Jamaica was too easy on them. It was too pleasant. Their lives were too good. They didn't have to struggle. This is Jamaica we're talking about here. We're talking about way high up in the Green Mountains, farming. But she thought that their lives were too easy because there wasn't enough pressure on them to make money. There wasn't enough pressure on them to send the kids to school or to, they did send the kids to school, but there wasn't enough pressure on them to fight their way up. And so that ideology about sort of Darwinian struggle and how they were not, they were losing their Anglo-Saxon facilities by the lack of struggle. So what they needed was to be moved to a town where they would starve if they didn't work hard. I mean, that is absolutely what she did. Like I said, yep, right. I mean, yeah.
It sounds, the documents there sound like they're a little different than other eugenics surveys. It doesn't sound like they're using like the language eugenics, like the sort of imbecile and that.
No, that's
it
right.
doesn't look like there's any family trees.
Right.
Like, is it because of like there's not a lot of racial diversity, so they had a different sort of lens on this?
Yeah, they did. They didn't want to document, family trees of degenerates in these towns. They were looking on this one theory of like, all these families had smart members, hardworking smart members, but all of them left. So it's not that the families that are left need to be purged, it's just that they also need to leave. So they didn't do a lot of that kind of stuff. They did, it does show up, the language of eugenics in the handwritten, in the long parts, but not nearly what you would expect. It's not, and also there's a difference. These are individual women. Harriet Abbott was far more into the idea of purging the degenerate than Ellen Anderson was. And it shows in the ways that she dealt with it. Ellen Anderson went on after this to write a book called We Americans in 1937, which was a study of the ethnic diversity in Burlington as if it were a good thing. So she was already moving toward a different kind of environmental interpretation of poverty and decline than what had been the case in the early eugenics days. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Given the thesis about the brightest and the best leaving, you didn't highlight, and I wondered if there were field notes in which they asked them about the relative.
Yes. They tried really hard to do an out-migration thing and to keep, there are files that are out-migrants that they just didn't get as much information as they wanted, and they're smaller and less clear. So I didn't use them in this study, but yeah, they did. They basically went to people's mothers and said, where's your daughter now? And she's like, oh, my daughter went to business college in Boston, and now she's a typist. And she wrote it down, and that would be it. So there wasn't any real ability. You couldn't really crunch the numbers on it or try to figure it out. But sure, one of the things I wanted to say as a kind of caveat to this study is that these are documents of the people who chose to stay. And you can easily imagine that for all the people who stay, there are going to be people who, I'm thinking to myself, they busted out of that town and they went to the bright lights of Greenfield and they never turned back. I think that's really true. There are a lot of people who are really thrilled to leave Jamaica, I'm sure. But the people who stayed for good reasons. In fact, I didn't say this in this talk, but almost nobody who was in line to get a farm left. So that's something to say. Yeah.
I was very struck in there he definitely talked about how these farms held up against the Depression because they were so sort of insular, right? And right, this perception then of like that this may look like poverty, but it all looked like poverty at the time. And now, but then it's how it transitions now eventually where like to have a self-sustaining hill farm would be amazing.
Yes,
I
I know. I mean, one of the things I was really struck by as I kept writing was, there are people doing this now with the same kinds of approach, the same kind of working with the limits of the land, the same kind of working with wooded land, the same emphasis on diversity of the crops and on their work. They have to all work outside the farm too. It's very, very similar. And I think one of the reasons I finally ended up doing this in part so that people who are trying to do it now would know that people had done it before. And you're right, you know, 1932 comes, you know, now who wants dad's potatoes and firewood? You know, it's either that or you're standing in line in Broward waiting for a handout. That's a good way to
Are they looking for vagabonds and transients too?
Not so much. It's interesting. Lots of people moved a lot in Jamaica, and they kept track of that. So I have a lot of data about who's come into town, who's left town, what the common understanding of a place like Jamaica is that nobody there has ever been anywhere. You know, nobody has ever left town. This is far from true. At least like 40%, I think it is, of people living in Jamaica had gone away for some substantial amount of time to come back. And that's not even really counting the people who went to Townsend or, you know, the various surrounding villages, but really people like, people would go for 5 years to Alaska and then come home, or they were in Boston for 3 years and then come home. So these are people who are actually choosing to come home, and that doesn't fit the eugenics notion at all, so they counted all screwy and rearranged their categories. You can see it in the notes, that they rearrange their findings till they get the numbers that they want to say. Anyway, yeah, they moved a lot. There are very few people who don't have a place to stay. I mean, there are 4 in Jamaica who the town is paying to live with another family to take them in. That's one of the things that I'll finish with this. That's okay there. One of the things I most love about the eugenics, the post-eugenics New Deal documents was a couple of maps I put into the book, which 1934, and they show which towns in Vermont, how many people in each town are on leave, taking federal money or something. And it's shown by percentage, like 15% of the town or less, 10%, 5%, like that, and then the numbers. And it's striking. There are big empty spots right around the mountains of Jamaica where not a single town has anybody on it. Now, there are good reasons that they might want to be on it, for sure, and they might. It's a shame, a problem for them, but it's statistically so striking that the towns which have the most people on relief are the industrial towns. Of course, it would make sense. But it also meant a certain kind of sense to someone in 1934 who was looking around and thinking, where can I go where I don't have to be on relief? How about one of these little farm towns? Shall we call it a day?